All right, so buckle up because today's deep dive is going to be a wild ride. You sent over all these articles about J.D. Vance, Blake Masters, and this whole new right thing. And honestly, this isn't the conservatism you learned in school. We're talking about a movement that's shaking up the political landscape, attracting some, well, let's say, interesting characters, and frankly, making a lot of people nervous.
You know, what's so fascinating about the new right is that it's not just a rebranding. It's not just like MAGA 2.0 or more QAnon stuff. It's deeper than that. There's a sense among a lot of people, not just on the right, that the whole system, the institutions, they're just broken.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Broken how? What exactly do they see as the problem?
They're saying that the government, the media, even colleges and universities, they're all more interested in protecting their own power than actually helping people.
Yeah.
And, you know, we've heard this before, right? Both sides complain about the system being rigged. But the new right, they're taking it to a whole other level with their response.
So it's not just about, like, lower taxes and less government.
Right, it goes way beyond that. They want to fundamentally change how power works in society. And a name that keeps popping up in all this that you sent me stuff about is Curtis Yarvin. He's the software developer turned, like, political philosopher. And his ideas, they're finding an audience even among some pretty powerful people, Peter Thiel, J.D. Vance, Blake Masters.
Oh, yeah, Yarvin is a whole other rabbit hole. But before we get too deep into that, what about Vance and Masters? They're the ones actually running for office, right? Trying to turn these ideas into laws.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting. You've got Vance, who everyone knows from Hillbilly Elegy, right? This very personal story about poverty and family struggles. And now he's saying we should totally restructure the federal government, even suggesting we fire all mid-level bureaucrats and replace them with, well, loyalists.
Wait, seriously? Fire them all? That's intense. And he's getting this from Yarvin.
He cited Yarvin directly, yeah.
Yeah.
It just shows how much influence these ideas have.
Okay, so if Vance is like the more, let's say, fiery side of the new life,
Right.
where does someone like Blake Masters fit in? He's a tech guy, right? Close to Thiel. You'd think he'd be more moderate.
Masters is interesting because he really embodies this tension in the movement between wanting to face the system from the inside and wanting to just blow it all up. I mean, he comes from Silicon Valley, right? He understands disruption. But he's also deeply critical of what he sees as the tech industry going too far, creating this almost dystopian world for a lot of people.
So he's like the techie who's seen the Matrix, and he's trying to unplug.
Exactly. And he's trying to reconcile that, this belief in technology's potential, but also this growing awareness of its dark side.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But how does this play out in actual policy? What are Vance and Masters proposing that's so different from, say, a normal Republican?
Well, that's where it gets tricky. The new right is still being defined. It's more like a bunch of ideas and anxieties, not a fully formed platform. But you can see some common threads.
Like, oh, give me an example.
Take family policy. Vance especially, he's really focused on this idea of strengthening families, of promoting pro-family policies.
Okay, that sounds pretty standard conservative stuff so far. What does he even mean by that? Like banning abortion, defunding Planned Parenthood?
Those are definitely part of it, but they go further. They're talking about expanding the child tax credit, giving parents paid leave, even direct subsidies to families.
Oh, hold on. That sounds a lot like, dare I say it, liberal policies. Isn't that Bernie Sanders territory?
You got it. And that's what makes the new right so fascinating. They'll take ideas from anywhere as long as it aligns with their goals. So yeah, a strong social safety net, but it's all about strengthening families their way.
So it's not about shrinking government, it's about using it differently.
Kind of. They're willing to use government power to intervene if they think it serves their idea of the social good. But, and this is important, they'll often favor policies that promote their very specific vision of what that good should be.
So it's not just about the policy itself, but who gets to decide and how it gets implemented.
Exactly. And that's where their critique of the system comes back in. They say the current system is biased against them, against their values. They point to the media a lot, saying it pushes a liberal agenda that's out of touch.
Which, you know, that distrust of the media, that's something you hear from both sides. Remember that whole fake news thing Trump was always on about? A lot of people, not just conservatives, feel like the media isn't on their side.
Exactly. And that's how the new right has been so successful at building this, like, coalition. They tap into this feeling that the system is rigged, and it resonates with a lot of people who feel left behind.
Okay, so we've got a movement that's skeptical of big government, but also wants to use it for its own ends. They're pro-family, but open to some traditionally liberal policies. And they're taking cues from Silicon Valley disruptors and, well, Curtis Yarvin? That's a lot to unpack.
It is, and honestly, we're just scratching the surface. But I think what's crucial here is that the new right doesn't fit into our neat little boxes. They're not your parents' conservatives. They're something new, something different. And to really get them, we need to think beyond our usual categories, be willing to see the complexity.
Okay, so we've established that this is complex, with its own unique set of ideas and grievances. But how did they get here? What's the story behind the story?
That's the question, right? And to answer it, we have to zoom out a bit.
Right.
We need to look at the bigger picture,
Yeah.
the social, economic, and cultural forces that created the conditions for something like the new right to emerge.
Okay, I'm ready to go deeper down the rabbit hole. Let's talk about those forces. All right, so we're talking about the bigger picture here, the social, economic, and cultural forces that led to the rise of something like the New Right.
Exactly. It's not like this movement just came out of nowhere. There's this whole confluence of factors at play. One of the big ones, I think, is this feeling of disillusionment with globalization.
Okay, yeah, you hear that a lot. Globalization this, globalization that. But what does it actually mean in this context?
Well, it means different things to different people, but for the new way, right? It often gets framed as this force that benefits the elites, the people at the top, at the expense of the working class. They see it as this driver of job losses, wages stagnating, factories closing down, and it's hit certain communities really hard.
Right, in those communities, they often feel like the people in charge, the ones calling the shots on trade deals and all that, they're not listening.
Exactly. They feel ignored, like their concerns don't matter. And that's something the new right is really good at tapping into, this idea that they're the champions of the forgotten man fighting for the little guy.
It's a powerful message, for sure, especially with so many people struggling financially these days.
Absolutely. And it's not just about economics either. There's a cultural dimension to this disillusionment, too.
Okay, you're going to have to break that one down for me. What's the cultural side of the new right's appeal?
Think about it like this. The world is changing so fast, right? Technology, globalization, social media. It can feel overwhelming, disorienting. And for some people, it creates this anxiety, this feeling that things are just spinning out of control.
Yeah, like the old rules don't apply anymore and nobody knows what the new ones are.
Exactly. And in that kind of environment, it's easy to see how a message of tradition, of order, of going back to a simpler time would be really appealing.
So the new right is offering some stability in a world that feels increasingly unstable.
That's a big part of it, yeah. They're promising to restore order, to slow things down, to protect traditional values and institutions.
And they see those traditional values as under attack.
Absolutely. They talk a lot about the erosion of the family, the decline of religion, this rise of secularism. They see these as threats to the very fabric of society, so they're calling for a return to this more traditional moral order.
It's interesting, though, because some of their policy ideas, like supporting a stronger social safety net, that seems to contradict this image of a traditional conservative, doesn't it?
Right. Because they aren't traditional conservatives. They're drawing from all sorts of influences. Some of them might surprise you. Like, one of the key figures shaping their thinking is this software developer named Curtis Yarvin.
Right, Yarvin. We talked about him earlier, the techno-monarchism guy,
Yeah.
dismantling democracy and all that.
Well, he might not use those exact words. But yeah, his ideas have been really influential in these circles. And what's interesting about Yarvin is that he doesn't fit neatly into our usual left-right categories.
How so?
Well, he's super skeptical of big government, which aligns with libertarianism, right? But he's also critical of free market capitalism, which puts him at odds with a lot of conservatives. And he's not afraid to borrow ideas from across the political spectrum as long as they fit into his broader worldview.
So he's kind of like a walking paradox, a
Yeah.
libertarian who criticizes capitalism, a software developer who's wary of technology's impact on society.
Exactly. He's a fascinating and complex thinker. And his ideas, even the ones that seem kind of out there, have found an audience with some segments of the new right.
Which brings us back to the question of what they actually want. What would a new right America look like?
It's tough to say for sure because, as we've been saying, this is a movement that's still being defined. But we can look for clues in their policy positions, their rhetoric, the intellectuals they draw from.
Okay, so let's do that. Let's say the new right gets what it wants. What concrete changes are we talking about, like in education, technology, immigration?
Let's start with education because that's one area where they've been very vocal.
All right, Vance has talked about defunding universities, and Masters has this whole thing about the dangers of, like, unchecked technological power.
Exactly. They see the education system, especially universities, as this battleground in the culture wars. They believe universities have become too liberal, too focused on pushing a progressive agenda.
And they're worried about indoctrination.
Yes. They believe students are being taught to hate America, reject traditional values, embrace a very specific radical leftist ideology.
So what's their solution? Abolish the Ivy League. Replace it all with, like, prayer circles and gun ranges.
It's not quite that extreme, but their proposals are a big departure from how things are now. They've talked about things like shifting funding away from traditional universities towards trade schools, vocational programs.
So more emphasis on practical skills instead of liberal arts.
Right. They argue this would better prepare students for the workforce, and it would mean fewer people graduating with tons of debt and no real-world skills.
It's an argument that resonates with a lot of people, especially those who feel like a college degree isn't a guarantee of a good job anymore.
Absolutely. And it taps into this broader anxiety about the value of higher education, which has become so expensive for so many Americans.
Okay, so we've got education. What about technology? That's another area where they seem to be doing their own thing.
Yeah, and this is where Master's background in Silicon Valley is really relevant. He's been critical of the power of these big tech companies, arguing that they have too much control over our lives, our data, even our thoughts.
He's not alone in that. There's a growing movement on both the left and the right to try to rein in Silicon Valley's power.
Totally. But what's different about the New Right's approach is their focus on the cultural impact of technology. They're not just worried about privacy or monopolies. They're worried about how technology is shaping our values, our relationships, our sense of self.
So it's not just about breaking up Facebook or regulating Google. It's about something much deeper.
Exactly. They're asking these big, almost philosophical questions. Like, is social media making us more isolated, more narcissistic? Are algorithms trapping us in these echo chambers? Are we becoming too reliant on technology, losing our ability to think for ourselves?
Those are some heavy questions. They're not easy to answer.
No, they're not. But they're questions we need to be asking. And the New Right, even if you disagree with their answers, they're forcing us to confront these issues head on.
Okay, so education technology. What about immigration? That's always a hot button issue, especially on the right. How does the New Right stance differ from, say, more traditional conservatives?
Well, they share some concerns with traditional conservatives about border security, illegal immigration, all of that. But their critique runs much deeper. They see immigration as a threat to national identity, to social cohesion.
In the sense that they worry about America losing its unique culture, its sense of self?
Exactly. They argue that mass immigration, especially from countries with very different cultural values, is eroding the fabric of American society. They're afraid it's leading to this loss of shared identity, a fragmentation of the nation.
And this fear is often tied to a sense of demographic anxiety, a worry about white America becoming a minority.
That's definitely a factor, though it's not always said out loud. They talk about preserving American culture, protecting our way of life, but there's often this unspoken racial element to those arguments.
It's that Make America Great Again sentiment, but repackaged for a new generation.
In some ways, yeah. They're tapping into that same kind of nostalgia, a longing for a time when America felt more unified, more homogenous.
So what does this mean practically? What are they actually proposing to do about immigration?
Generally, they favor significantly reducing immigration overall, stricter border controls, and being much more selective about who gets to come in.
Okay, so less about building walls, more about carefully guarding the gates.
Exactly. They're not necessarily opposed to all immigration. They recognize that America has always been a nation of immigrants, right? But they believe it needs to be controlled, managed in a way that they believe preserves America's unique national identity.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers, and
No.
one that's probably going to be debated for a long time.
For sure. But it also highlights this fundamental tension at the heart of the New Right, this desire to preserve the past and shape the future, to both reject change and embrace it.
It's a tough needle to thread. And honestly, it feels like it could lead to some real internal conflicts, contradictions within the movement itself as it evolves.
Absolutely. The New Right is very much a work in progress, and it'll be interesting to see how those tensions play out in the coming years.
Okay, so we've covered education, technology, and immigration. What other areas are they focused on? What else is on the new right's to-do list?
Well, one area where they're starting to gain some traction is in their critique of what they see as the excesses of individualism.
Okay, individualism. What's wrong with that? I thought that was like a core American value.
It is, and they would agree with that to a point. But they argue that it's been taken too far, that we've become too focused on individual rights and freedoms at the expense of our responsibilities to each other, to our communities.
So they're talking about a decline in community and social cohesion.
Exactly. They see this as a symptom of a broader cultural decline, this sense of atomization, isolation that's leading to all sorts of social problems, everything from crime rates to declining marriage rates.
And they believe the answer lies in returning to more traditional social structures, a greater emphasis on family, faith, community.
Exactly. They see those institutions as the building blocks of a healthy society, the sources of meaning and purpose that give our lives structure and stability.
But how do you reconcile that with their embrace of figures like Yarvin, who seem to advocate for this very individualistic approach to governance?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's one of the many contradictions within this movement, this tension between their desire for individual liberty and social order.
It's like they want to have their cake and eat it too.
In a way, yes. They want the freedom to live their lives how they see fit, but they also recognize the need for some level of social cohesion, some shared understanding of what it means to be a good citizen, a good neighbor, a good person.
It's a difficult balance to strike, and it doesn't seem like they've quite figured it out yet.
No, they haven't. But that's what makes this movement so fascinating to watch. They're wrestling with some of the biggest, most fundamental questions facing society today. And while their answers might not always be satisfying or even coherent, I think their willingness to at least ask the tough questions is really refreshing.
So where do we go from here? What's next for the new right? Where do you see this movement heading?
That's the big question, isn't it? And unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball.
No crystal ball required. Just your expert analysis. What are the key factors that will determine where the new right goes from here?
Well, I think one crucial factor will be their ability to take their ideas and turn them into concrete policy proposals that appeal to a wider audience. So far, they've been much better at criticizing the status quo than offering viable alternatives.
So they need to move beyond the realm of ideas and into the messy world of real-world politics.
Exactly. They need to demonstrate that their vision for America isn't just theoretically appealing, but actually achievable. They need to convince voters that they have real solutions to the country's problems, not just grievances and complaints.
That's a tall order, especially in the current political climate. It feels like everyone's just retreating further into their own corners.
It is, but it's not impossible. The new right has already proven they can appeal to a diverse group of voters, including some who wouldn't typically identify as conservative. If they can build on that, develop a more coherent and persuasive policy platform, they could become a major force in American politics for years to come.
So the new right, passing fad or a sign of a much bigger political shift?
Only time will tell. But one thing's for sure. Their ideas, their anxieties, their critiques, those aren't going away anytime soon. And whether you agree with them or not, they deserve our attention. They deserve to be engaged with. We need to try to understand the forces shaping our world, even the ones we might not like.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this part of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, the social, economic, and cultural forces that led to the rise of the new right, and we even dug into some of their key policy positions.
It's been a fascinating conversation, and I think the biggest takeaway is that the new right is complex, constantly evolving. It defies easy categorization or prediction.
Absolutely. But by trying to understand their motivations, their anxieties, their vision for the future, we can better equip ourselves to participate in the debates that are shaping our world. Now, we've talked a lot about the new right's critique of the status quo, their desire for a more traditional society, their policy proposals. But there's one aspect we haven't explored yet, their relationship with technology.
That's an interesting point. You're right, we've touched on it, but haven't really gone into the specifics of how they view technology's role in society.
Exactly. And it feels crucial to their worldview because on the one hand, they're often linked to Silicon Valley, right? To figures like Peter Thiel and Blake Masters, who are at the forefront of tech innovation. But at the same time, they seem to have this deep skepticism about how technology is impacting our lives, our culture, even our humanity.
It's a fascinating paradox, and it speaks to this broader tension within the new right between embracing progress and longing for a simpler time.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit. How do they reconcile this seemingly contradictory stance on technology?
Well, I think the first thing to remember is that their views on technology are not monolithic. Just like with any issue, there's a spectrum of opinions within the movement.
So you've got your techno-utopians on one end, who believe technology will solve all our problems, and then your techno-pessimists on the other, who think it's the root of all evil.
That's a bit of an oversimplification, but you get the idea. And of course, there's a whole range of views in between.
So where do people like Vance and Masters fall on that spectrum? They both have ties to the tech world, but they've also criticized its excesses.
Right. They represent a kind of middle ground within the movement. They recognize technology's power to improve our lives, but they're also keenly aware of its potential downsides.
Like what, specifically?
Well, they worry about how technology is eroding our privacy, our autonomy, our attention spans. They're concerned about the addictive nature of social media, the spread of misinformation online, the rise of automation and its impact on jobs.
These are all legitimate concerns, and ones that resonate with people across the political spectrum.
Exactly. And that's what makes the new right's critique of technology so interesting. It doesn't fit neatly into our usual left-right boxes. It's not about being pro-technology or anti-technology. It's about being, as they see it, pro-human.
Pro-human, what does that mean in this context?
It means putting human flourishing at the center of technological development. It's about asking ourselves not just what technology can do, but what it should do. How can we use its power to create a more just, equitable, and humane society?
So it's not about rejecting technology altogether. It's about using it in a way that serves our needs, not the other way around.
Exactly. And that requires us to be thoughtful, discerning, and maybe most importantly, critical in our engagement with technology.
Critical in what sense?
In the sense of not just accepting technology at face value, but questioning its assumptions, its biases, its potential consequences. We need to be willing to ask those hard questions about the role technology is playing in our lives and in society, and to demand better from the people and institutions that are creating it and controlling it.
That's a big ask, especially in a world where technology is changing so rapidly.
It is, but it's a challenge we can't afford to ignore. The stakes are too high. The choices we make now about how we develop and use technology will have a huge impact on the future.
So what does a new right approach to technology actually look like in practice? What are they suggesting we do differently?
Well, their specific policy ideas vary, but they tend to favor a more hands-on approach to regulating the tech industry. They're not afraid to use government power to protect consumers, promote competition, and try to ensure that technology is being developed and used responsibly and ethically.
So less hands-off, more interventionist.
Exactly. They believe that the market alone can't be trusted to regulate itself, especially when it comes to something as powerful and potentially disruptive as technology.
Okay, so they're open to government regulation, but what about some of the more utopian ideas we've heard from them? We talked earlier about Curtis Yarvin and his vision for this decentralized internet, this world of digital patchworks and realms.
Ah, yes, Yarvin's more out there ideas. It's easy to dismiss them as the ramblings of a fringe thinker, but I think they're worth looking at, if only to understand the full spectrum of the new right's thinking on technology.
Okay, humor me. Walk me through Yarvin's vision. What's this whole patchwork thing about?
In essence, Yarvin believes the nation-state, like the very idea of countries as we know them, is outdated. He says it's just not equipped to handle the complexities of the 21st century. He argues we need a new form of governance, something more decentralized, more adaptable, and more responsive to people's needs.
Okay, I'm definitely getting libertarian vibes here. The whole government is the problem, not the solution thing.
There is an element of that, sure, but Yarvin's vision is more nuanced than just shrinking the government and hoping for the best. He imagines a world where power is distributed among a network of smaller, self-governing entities, which he calls patchworks.
So instead of one big country, we have a bunch of little mini countries, each with its own rules and laws.
Essentially, yes. Each patchwork would be governed by a realm, which Yarvin describes as a kind of corporation with absolute power over its citizens.
Hold on, a corporation with absolute power. That sounds pretty dystopian, even for Yarvin.
It's certainly a provocative idea, and one that's drawn a lot of criticism, even from people who are sympathetic to his other work. But Yarvin argues that these realms wouldn't be like traditional corporations, beholden to shareholders and driven solely by profit.
So what would motivate them then? Altruism. A desire to serve the common good.
Yarvin believes they'd be motivated by a few things, including competition, reputation, and a desire to attract and retain citizens. He argues that in a world where people are free to choose where they live, these realms would have to offer a high quality of life and a responsive government if they wanted to survive.
It's an interesting thought experiment, for sure. But it's hard for me to imagine how this would work in the real world. Would these realms have their own armies, their own currencies? Would they be constantly at war with each other?
Those are all valid questions. And to be fair, Yarvin's writing on this is often more about suggesting ideas than giving a detailed plan. He doesn't really offer a blueprint for how this patchwork system would actually work, which makes it hard to judge how realistic it is.
It feels a bit like he's sketching out this utopian ideal without really explaining how to get there.
That's a fair assessment. But even if Yarvin's vision for a patchwork world never happens, I think it's worth considering the core argument behind it.
Which is?
That the nation-state, as a way of governing ourselves, is struggling to keep up with how fast the world is changing. That the problems we face today, climate change, pandemics, technological disruption, these require new ways of working together, new ways of organizing ourselves.
So even if we don't buy into Yarvin's specific solutions, we should at least be open to the possibility that we need to rethink some of our most basic assumptions about how we govern ourselves.
Exactly. And that's a conversation that's already happening in certain circles. You see it in the rise of things like city-level diplomacy, the growing influence of these international organizations, the emergence of new types of digital governance.
So maybe Yarvin is onto something, even if his proposed solutions are a bit out there?
It's possible, but even if his patchwork world never happens, I think his work is a useful thought experiment, a reminder that the future isn't set in stone. We have the power to shape it, to create new systems that are more just, more equitable, and more sustainable.
Okay, so to sum up, we've got a group of intellectuals and activists who are really unhappy with the way things are. They want to create a more traditional, community-oriented society, and they're willing to consider some pretty radical ideas to get there.
That's one way to put it.
They're drawing inspiration from everywhere, from ancient philosophers to Silicon Valley disruptors, and their message is resonating.
It is, and I think what's important to remember is that the New Right isn't this monolithic block with a single unified agenda. It's a collection of individuals and groups, each with their own anxieties, their own priorities, but they share this willingness to challenge conventional thinking.
And while we might not agree with all their ideas, or even most of them, I think it's crucial to at least try to understand where they're coming from, to engage with their arguments, and to offer a compelling alternative vision for the future.
Exactly, because the future isn't something that just happens to us. It's something we create together. And the choices we make today will determine what kind of world we leave behind.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about. From the surprisingly nuanced aspects of their policy positions to the, shall we say, more imaginative elements of Yarvin's philosophy, this deep dive has been quite the journey.
It really has. And it's a testament to the power of ideas, to their ability to shape how we see the world and to inspire both hope and fear. It's also a reminder that we all have a responsibility to wrestle with these big questions, these complex issues, and to try to build a better future for ourselves and for generations to come.
Well said. But before we wrap up, I have to ask, what about the role of religion in all of this? We've touched on their support for faith-based initiatives, but there seems to be a deeper spiritual dimension to this movement that we haven't fully explored.
You're right, that's an important aspect that we haven't delved into yet. The New Right's relationship with religion is complex and multifaceted. While they draw heavily on religious rhetoric and appeal to traditional moral values, their approach is, I'd say, more pragmatic than dogmatic.
Interesting. So less about blind faith and more about using religion as a tool to achieve their political goals.
To some extent, yes. They recognize that religion can be a powerful mobilizing force. It has this ability to inspire loyalty, to provide a sense of meaning and purpose that a lot of people find appealing, especially in a world that often feels very secular, even nihilistic.
And let's be real. In a world that can feel increasingly secular, even nihilistic at times, that kind of spiritual grounding can be very appealing.
Absolutely. And they've been very effective at tapping into that yearning, that hunger for something to believe in.
Okay, so they see the strategic value of religion. But what about their actual beliefs? Are they all devout Christians? Is there room for atheists or agnostics in this movement?
Well, there's definitely a strong Christian presence, especially Catholic, within the new right. You see it in figures like Vance, who converted to Catholicism, and
Mhm.
in their support for traditional family values, their opposition to things like abortion and same-sex marriage.
Right, that whole moral majority vibe. But what about those who don't fit neatly into that box? Are they just out of luck?
It's not quite that simple. While they might not agree on every theological point, what unites them is this shared belief in the importance of a strong moral foundation, this sense that society has lost its way.
So it's less about following a specific dogma and more about embracing a certain set of values:
Hmm.
faith, family, community, tradition.
Exactly. They see these values as essential to a healthy society, as bulwarks against individualism, secularism, moral relativism, things they believe are eroding the very foundation of Western civilization.
Okay, I can see how that message would resonate with people who are feeling unmoored, adrift in a world that seems to be changing faster than ever.
Exactly. And it's one of the reasons why I think it's so important to really engage with this movement, to try to understand its appeal, even as we critique some of its more troubling aspects.
Because if we just dismiss them as a bunch of religious zealots, we miss the opportunity to understand those deeper anxieties, the very real concerns that are driving this movement.
Precisely. And we risk further alienating the very people who are drawn to their message, creating an even wider gap in our already very polarized society.
So what's the takeaway here? How should we be thinking about the role of religion in all of this?
Well, I think it's important to remember that religion, like any powerful force, can be used for good or for ill. It can be a source of comfort, of inspiration, of social justice, but it can also be used to justify oppression, to demonize others, to silence dissent.
So the key is to be discerning, to approach it with a critical eye, to be wary of those who might exploit faith for their own ends.
Exactly. And to remember that at the heart of most, if not all, religious traditions is a call to compassion, to love, to justice. And it's those values ultimately that should guide our actions, our interactions with one another, and our vision for a more just and equitable world.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the philosophical underpinnings of the new right to their specific policy ideas to the, shall we say, more creative aspects of their worldview.
It's been a fascinating exploration, to say the least. And I think the key takeaway is that this is a movement that's still very much in flux. It's hard to categorize, hard to predict, and it demands our attention, even if we find some of their ideas unsettling.
Well said. And with that, we'll leave you to ponder Yarvin's provocative closing thought. In a world of increasing complexity and frustration with the status quo, what are we willing to consider to create a better future?
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Are we okay with just like tinkering around the edges of a system that a lot of people think is fundamentally broken? Or are we ready to consider some much more radical changes? To really question our assumptions? Maybe even embrace entirely new ways of thinking about how we govern ourselves.
And you know what strikes me? This isn't just a question for the new right.
Hmm.
It feels like everyone, no matter what their politics are, is wrestling with this sense that the old ways of doing things just aren't working anymore.
Absolutely. And that's why I think this deep dive has been so useful, so illuminating. It's forced us to confront some hard truths, to challenge our own biases, and really try to understand perspectives that we might not normally engage with.
It's definitely shown how those lines between left and right, between conservative and progressive, they're getting blurrier. The new right seems to be taking ideas from all over the political map, shaping them to fit their worldview, and creating this new kind of political conversation that's really hard to define.
Exactly. And that's precisely why it's so important to engage with this movement, even if we find some of their ideas a little unnerving. It's tempting to just write them off as a fringe group, but doing that just widens the gap in our already incredibly polarized society.
We miss the chance to learn from them, to figure out where their critiques resonate, and maybe offer a more compelling alternative that actually gets at the root of what's driving their discontent.
Precisely. Instead of just dismissing them, we should be asking ourselves, why is their message finding an audience? What anxieties are they tapping into? What solutions are they proposing that traditional left and right-wing politics seem to be missing?
So, in this increasingly complex, increasingly polarized world, how do we even begin to navigate all of this?
I think it starts with, honestly, a little humility. We need to admit that none of us have all the answers, that we all have our blind spots, that we're all influenced by our own echo chambers to some degree.
So, less shouting, more listening, More open-mindedness, less clinging to dogma.
Exactly. And a willingness to have real, good faith conversations, even with people whose views are drastically different from our own. We need to remember that despite our differences, we're all part of this experiment, this thing we call democracy, and we all have a stake in making it work.
It's easy to forget that sometimes in the middle of all the back and forth, the often, frankly, toxic nature of how we talk about politics these days.
It is. But that's why it's more important than ever to find common ground wherever we can. Identify those shared values, those areas where our goals overlap, and work together to create a future that benefits everyone, not just a select few.
And that doesn't mean abandoning our principles, compromising what we believe in. It's about finding ways to build bridges, to reach consensus, to create a society that genuinely works for everyone.
Absolutely. And that takes courage. The courage to step outside of our comfort zones, to have those tough conversations, and yes, even to compromise when we need to. Because the alternative is this future of endless conflict, where our differences just become bigger and bigger until they seem impossible to overcome.
That's a pretty bleak picture. And honestly, I think even Yarvin, with his talk of radical change, even he recognizes that descending into chaos isn't the answer. He might advocate for a total restructuring of power, a complete reimagining of how we govern ourselves. But even he seems to be searching for something more stable, more equitable.
He is. And that's why even if we completely reject his specific solutions, we can still appreciate his desire for a better world, his recognition that something has to change.
It's been quite a journey, this exploration of the new right. I'll admit, some of the ideas we've encountered seemed pretty out there at first. But digging deeper, you start to see a certain complexity, a nuance that challenges how we typically think about these things.
The new right, with their unconventional thinking, their willingness to question everything, they remind us that the future isn't preordained. It's something we actively create through the choices we make, the actions we take, and how we choose to engage with the biggest challenges of our time.
This deep dive has given us a lot to think about, that's for sure. So where do we go from here? How do we take all of this and turn it into meaningful action?
That's the million-dollar question, right? It's not enough to just understand the issues. We need to find ways to channel that understanding into positive change.
So what's the first?
It starts with staying informed, staying engaged. Don't shy away from those tough conversations. Actively seek out different perspectives and be willing to listen with an open mind.
And then when?
Then we need to find ways to get involved, to participate in the process, whether that's voting, volunteering for a cause we believe in, even just talking to our friends and family about the things that matter to us.
It can feel overwhelming though, right? Like, how much can one person really do when we're facing such big, complicated problems?
I get it. It can definitely feel that way. But it's important to remember that change happens gradually, one conversation at a time, one vote at a time, one act of courage at a time.
So don't underestimate the power of your own voice, your own actions to make a difference.
Exactly. The future isn't something that happens to us. It's something we create together.
And on that note of empowered creation, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the new right and their impact on the political landscape. It's been, shall we say, enlightening.
It really has. And remember, this journey of understanding, it's ongoing. So keep asking those tough questions, keep challenging assumptions, and keep striving to create a more just and equitable world for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself.